First thing in the morning, Patriarca waived extradition to Massachusetts, a necessary formality before he could be taken to New Bedford for arraignment. Security was heavy, although it appeared to be entirely police. There were no people around Patriarca who appeared to be private bodyguards. In New Bedford, security was heavy as well, and a large crowd of the curious gathered outside the courthouse to watch as Patriarca arrived. He looked terrible. Eyes closed, oxygen tubes in his nose, and intravenous medication being poured into him as he was carried up the steps of the building and into court, surrounded by emergency medical technicians. He rarely moved a muscle as he lay on the stretcher in court. The clerk read the charges against him: accessory before the fact of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Attorney John Cicilline told the court Patriarca pleads innocent on both counts. The indictments stem from the 1968 murder of one Robert Candos. Patriarca allegedly ordered Candos's murder. Patriarca was then removed from the courtroom while prosecution and defense argued over bail. Assistant DA Robert Kane wanted bail set at $1 million.
His reputation in this community is alarming. His criminal record reaches back to 1926 and involves over 30 arrests which contain multiple convictions for murder on both the state and federal levels.
Judge Robert Prince listened to both sides, then set bail at $500,000 or $50,000 cash. Afterward, Attorney Cicilline told reporters that he doubts his client will ever be well enough to stand trial.
If he's put through a number of these other proceedings that are scheduled and his condition hasn't changed, there's a great likelihood that he will suffer the sudden death syndrome that the doctors have talked about.
But District Attorney Ronald Pena is not convinced and feels that Patriarca can and will be tried within the next few months.
I'm sure it's coincidence, but he seems to get ill every time there's an indictment about to issue against him. And then I hear that he's going to have a pacemaker, and I'm not sure he has one, and then I hear he didn't have a pacemaker. So I don't have any real medical analysis as to whether or not he is capable of standing trial. So we're ready to go. We anticipate that this case is being put together, and as soon as the defense counsel is ready, and that's giving him a reasonable opportunity to prepare his defense, that we'll be ready to try this case.
With bail posted, Patriarca was then taken back to Miriam Hospital. Now that the arraignment is over, he is no longer under arrest and he can go home. Some say to stage a miraculous recovery. Others say to die. Mark Haynes, News Center 12, New Bedford.
The jury returned to the fifth floor courtroom at 2:42 this afternoon. They had been deliberating since Friday afternoon. Before the verdict, Judge Eugene Gallant cautioned the spectators, most friends of the defendants, against any sporadic outbursts. A contingent of Providence police was brought in to bolster the already heavy security guard. When the foreman announced the not guilty verdict, the gallery burst into brief applause despite the judge's warnings. The 63-year-old Patriarca drooped in his chair a bit and then briefly cried. He had been charged with being an accessory before the 1968 shotgun slayings of Rudolph Marfio and Anthony Maley in a Providence grocery store. An earlier trial resulted in a hung jury. The trial was highlighted by the testimony of a Catholic priest who first testified that he was with Patriarca when he was supposed to have been at a crucial meeting that connected the defendant with the crime. Later, the priest came back to tell the court he had his dates mixed up, and indeed he was not with the defendant on the date in question. The most crucial testimony, however, was that given by John Red Kelly, an underworld figure from Watertown, Massachusetts, who said he mapped the getaway route on the orders of Patriarca. Eventually, the case boiled down to whether or not the jury believed that testimony, and according to co-defense counsel Raymond Daniels, this is what won the case.
The turning point in the trial was Kelly's testimony. Having cross-examined him at length for some 3 days back in February and March at the trial of the 4 co-defendants, I was thoroughly prepared to bring out all the inconsistencies, and he completely changed his testimony, particularly as to the most important dates. A typical example was where he testified that one Louis Monacchio was at a meeting with him, a most important meeting, on April 2nd, 1968. As it turned out, we produced evidence 3 months ago that Mr. Monacchio was in the custody of the Providence Police Department that entire evening and could not have possibly been there. Accordingly, at this trial, Mr. Kelly again changed his testimony to conform with his new false version.
Well, now, Mr. Patriarca will be returned to federal prison. When possibly could he be freed now?
He could possibly be freed sometime in September of this year.
This coming September?
Yes.
What do you think the results of this trial will do to pending cases that Kelly will have to testify in, or is supposed to testify in?
I think Kelly's credibility has been severely damaged, if not totally destroyed. Obvious lies that I think he should be prosecuted for perjury. I was a prosecutor in Los Angeles for the District Attorney's Office for 11 years. And had I had anything to do with this case, from the prosecution standpoint in this case, in this state, I would have dismissed this case a long time ago.
Raymond Patriarca today ended the long argument about whether he was too sick to testify in court about his hand in the organized crime of New England. Patriarca died this afternoon in Rhode Island Hospital after a heart attack at home in Providence. He was close to the movie stereotype of the Godfather in blue suits and white socks. He was a family man and a churchgoer who called himself a businessman, but who had the personal authority to impose martial law in the Boston underworld when he needed it to settle a gang war. Ex-mafia men Joe Valachi and Vinnie Teresa, as well as the FBI, agreed he was #1 in New England. Rhode Island's Attorney General Dennis Roberts said today that Patriarca's son and namesake from Lincoln, Rhode Island, is the logical successor, unless, he said, the New York crime families move in. Roberts' analysis seemed to leave the Boston candidates for Patriarca's job out of the running.
And I know I wasn't attending no meetings or going no place with a heart condition.
Raymond L.S. Patriarca, the man of contradictions who ran organized crime in New England for 40 years. A man with a reputation of being ruthless to his enemies, kind and gentle to his neighbors, was laid to rest today. The funeral of Patriarca, termed a private event by his family, saw spectators starting to gather shortly after 8 o'clock this morning, across from the Baraducci Funeral Home on Broadway in Providence's Federal Hill section, where Patriarca grew up. Some of Rhode Island's top mobsters and defense lawyers were among the mourners who began arriving at the funeral home. While family and friends pay their last respects to Raymond Patriarca, hundreds of people, many of them sidewalk mourners, line both sides of busy Broadway here on Federal Hill. Some were upset.
Take it. Take what you want. Cut that out. You're invading my privacy.
At the back of the funeral home on Grove Street, in spite of scorching heat, much the same story. Journalists, spectators, and law enforcement officials from around New England.
Now that Raymond Patriarca is out of the picture, we will be monitoring the fact on who surfaces to inherit the throne.
Following a massive Christian burial at the funeral home, Patriarca's immediate family left the mortuary. The procession moved along Atwell's Avenue through the heart of Federal Hill. Family and friends took part in a short service at the chapel of the Gate of Heaven Cemetery in East Providence. Others were carefully screened by men in dark suits and sunglasses. One of them threw out the unwelcome wagon to members of the press corps.
If you think you're going to intimidate me with the camera, you're not. I wish you to leave.
Following the chapel service, the body of the reputed crime boss was taken to the family mausoleum. Close relatives and friends paid their final tributes to Patriarca within the tomb. To many, it's the end of an era. In East Providence, Jack Burns, News Center 12.